welcome to Pelgrane Press's How to Put Cthulhu in Your Fantasy Game panel. We're going to introduce our panelists, and then I have some first questions for everybody. We'll have
I got my henchman shirt on.
Yes. We'll have some back and forth after that, and then we'll open it up to questions, at which point I'll ask our beloved attendees to use the hands up feature in order to pose questions. And as I'll repeat later on, we have 5 panelists and me, your humble moderator, so we want to get everybody's questions in, so we're going to try and limit the number of people who answer each question. So let us start with introductions. I am writer and game designer Randy Laws. My Cthulhu-y credentials include writing Gumshoe Engine, which is the basis of Trail of Cthulhu, and fiction such as New Tales of the Yellow Sign and the Yellow King role-playing game, which has no Cthulhu in it, but is Cthulhu adjacent. And now a man who needs no introduction, but is going to get one anyway. We are very honored to have with us today Sandy Petersen, the designer of Call of Cthulhu, the man who started Cthulhu being in gaming, and he will have many more exciting, new, fresher Cthulhu things to tell us about. Hey, Sandy, how you doing?
I'm doing great. So is this where I introduce myself, or do you figure that's done good enough already?
I surely have not covered all the bases. Please introduce yourself.
I did the very first Cthulhu game, which was Call of Cthulhu, which is still being sold by Chaosium. I worked on the original Arkham Horror, though I was not the designer, just a developer. I snuck Cthulhu into the video games I did for 22 years, and I am now I now own a game company which has projects which often feature Cthulhu. Notably, the board game Cthulhu Wars and my new role-playing project, Sandy Petersen's Cthulhu Mythos for D&D, or actually for 5e to avoid copyright violation, but you know.
We also have with us some folks who are working on a fantasy game for Gumshoe that has some Cthulhu-ish elements in it. And Emily Dresner, tell us more about yourself and your work on Swords of the Serpentine.
Hi, my name is Emily. I am the co-author of Swords of the Serpentine, which I wrote with Kevin, who's like in a little square to the right to me on my Zoom. I do want to mention that I am Sandy Petersen's biggest fanboy. My favorite game of all time is Call of Cthulhu 5th Edition. Sneak that in there. So I wrote the setting for Swords of the Serpentine. I wrote a column over on Critical Hits called Dungeonomics, which started off on my little blog. I worked on Vampire, worked for Steve Jackson Games. I worked on Big Eye Small Mouth supplements and a bunch of smaller stuff. So, and I've worked in the video game industry. So I'm super thrilled to be here, and I'm super stoked to talk about Cthulhu and fantasy games.
All right, so Kevin, partner in crime on Swords of the Serpentine, also designer of Time Watch. Tell us more about yourself.
Sure, I am a fatigue and alertness and shift work consultant full-time. My games include Alhoot Trail, which was sort of a cross between D&D and the Old West. Time Watch, which did include a Cthulhian Lovecraftian frame where you're time traveling, you deal with Lovecraftian horrors. And, of course, Swords of the Serpentine, which is the newest Gumshoe game focused on fantasy, swords, and sorcery.
And Kenneth Hite, my partner in crime on the podcast Ken and Robin Talk About Stuff, designer of Trail of Cthulhu. But that just scratches the surface of your Cthulhuoid expertise.
It's a deep scratch, though. Trail of Cthulhu, the licensed adaptation of the greatest role-playing game ever, Sandy Petersen's Call of Cthulhu, for Pelgrane. In addition to that, most recently for Pelgrane, Fall of Delta Green, which is the Delta Green role-playing game adapted to Gumshoe and set in the 1960s. I also worked on the Delta Green role-playing game, did other things for the Delta Green line, and most recently toured Lovecraft to the destinations is winging its way to backer kit fulfillment. Even as we speak, it should be available almost certainly when you've downloaded this later and you're like, Tour de Lovecraft, I'd like to get that. Well, then you can, just not right now.
And finally, we have Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan. Your expertise in both fantasy and things with tentacles is also vast. Share it with us, please.
Off the top of my head, because there's lots of things with tentacles out there, I've written a bunch of stuff for Trail of Cthulhu. I've run Skull of Cthulhu at our local gaming convention every year straight since 1997, which alarmingly dates me. And yes, I've put lots of tentacle things into various fantasy games and novels. I have a pair of novels which involve ghouls and worms that walks as major protagonists. And I've done lots of D&D or F20-esque things involving giant company monsters, some of which are dungeons.
So Sandy, the title of this panel is How to Put Cthulhu in Your Fantasy Games. And the short answer would be to get your exciting new products and use them. But that would be a very short panel. So why don't you tell us about how you set about melding Cthulhu and fantasy in these books. And of course, along the way, sneakily tell people how to acquire them.
So I missed almost all of what you said.
So please tell us about how your exciting new projects help people put Cthulhu in their role-playing games, and of course, how can they go about getting them?
Lovecraftian stuff is already a fantasy element added to the real world. And if you play Call of Cthulhu anywhere except 2020 in your hometown, then you're always putting some fantasy things in. But the advantage of fantasy for D&D is that you're giving people a game system that they already know, or Pathfinder for that matter, or whatever. You're giving a game system they already know and are familiar with and know how to handle, and you're giving them the fun of creepy, terrifying, horrible things menacing everything that they know and love, which is, I assume, the draw. At least it is for me, and for them too. To support this and show how it's done, we're also releasing a series of things called the Cthulhu Mythos sagas, which are essentially 4-volume campaigns in a D&D-ish universe with heavily Lovecraftian themes. The first one was Ghoul Island. We did that last fall, which has ghouls worshipping Ghatanathoa and all kinds of hijinks. Right now we're doing Yig Snake Granddaddy, which features bringing ancient horrors from the past to modern world and having things go wrong. Next up is Dark Worlds, where D&D characters go to Yuggoth and experience that. So, or were you asking for more specific ideas about how to do it in your fantasy world?
That's a great start. So more specifically, let's ask the question, D&D and its offshoots are about becoming gradually more powerful. Call of Cthulhu and other games inspired by that are traditionally thinking that you matter in the universe and slowly discovering that you are not powerful, that you are anything but. How do you reconcile those two things within a fantasy game?
Well, you are absolutely right. Of course, Call of Cthulhu was done in a very contrarian way, with characters that get crappier over time rather than better. There's two ways of doing it. One way is to have their awesome characters that matter in the world because they have learned so much and then find out they don't, just like in Call of Cthulhu. The other is, what's often done in a lot of things, is you simply take the horror elements that are fun for you and add them as a flavor or an infusion to your fantasy, and you can add more and more or less and less. The same way that, for example, there is a legit horror element in something like in Aliens, which is primarily an action movie, or in Shaun of the Dead, which is also a comedy, but the horror elements are still real elements in those, and make them a better movie, I feel.
So Ken, the process of putting fantasy and the Cthulhu mythos together started early on with authors who were in contact with Lovecraft and building out his mythos, and in some cases, particularly with Robert E. Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, bringing them to the fantasy genre. So how did they go about solving, or was it a question for them to solve the question of blending the fantasy genre and the horror genre?
I mean, of course, they're writing before we even have the concept of genre. Genre is basically being invented all around them as the box in which you put Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard and some of C.L. Moore, but not all of C.L. Moore. Or you put some of C.S. Lewis and most of Tolkien and half of Moorcock. And so the whole concept of the genre was still fluid at the time, and so was the philosophical backing, if you want to give it that grand title, of the Cthulhu mythos. At the time, Lovecraft and his buddies, including Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, treated the mythos more amongst themselves as an in-joke. And so, although Clark Ashton Smith, for example, would create a setting in which he could tell ironic tales of sex and danger, because that is what Clark Ashton Smith thought narrative ought to be, and Lovecraft would then write Clark Ashton Smith fan fiction, basically, in which he said, but there's a darker dimension to your sex and danger. And they were basically playing that game back and forth with each other. So Clark Ashton Smith, when he writes, the Weird of Avuzal-Wuthaqwan or the Seven Geases, he's writing an ironic, dark-humored, sexy joke, because that is what he's writing everywhere. And those qualities of irony and earthiness are what he values. And if, Clark Ashton Smith had been the guy whose acolytes had founded a publishing house, and we were all like, oh, H.P. Lovecraft, he was that guy that was buddies with Clark Ashton Smith, then we'd be wondering, how do we fit the bleak world of Lovecraft into what we understand as the sardonic, ironic, modernist pose of the mythos? So they were only taking the parts that appealed to them, and in Clark Ashton Smith's sense, it was he wanted to make an elder god, but an elder god who thought it was all funny, which is where you got Tsathoggua, half toad, half bat, all elder god. And Robert E. Howard, of course, presents the mythos as the embodiment of the chaos at the heart of barbarism. And his stories are all about internal and conflict mirrored as external conflict. And so he's like, the mythos is a thing to be killed by or to kill. And in the very much the sense that Sandy was talking about, he was very much putting the mythos in as flavor text in things like Worms of the Earth to answer his larger philosophical answer that human structures are fundamentally valueless and only individual humans matter. And so what matters is how you fight and how you die, not your philosophical place in the universe. So both of them are using the mythos for their own philosophical ends or artistic ends. I think it's kind of hard to ascribe a philosophy to Smith, but both of them are using the mythos their own way for their own ends, and that is, in fairness, I think the way that most people have done it. And when August Derleth does it, we all get mad at him. And when Clark Ashton Smith does it, we're like, well, that's just Clark being Clark. So I would say, carry on in that great Smithian Howardian tradition and play with the mythos like it's your buddy Howard writing you crazy stories and fanfic about your own universe.
So Emily, your setting design for Swords of the Serpentine is about creating a new fantasy world for a particular sort of play. And because it is inspired by Howard, or at least a modern take on Howard, there are some mythos-y elements in it. How did you decide which elements would best fit the fantasy genre, and how did you go about building them into Eversink, the setting of the game?
Right. So obviously, Eversink, Swords of the Serpentine is not D&D. We don't want like Nyarlathotep appears roll initiative, but we can take a lot of cues from Lovecraftian mythos when building a fantasy setting. We have gods. A lot of the gods are nameless. Some are small, some are nice, but most of them are awful. Some are elder. Some come from a time before man. Some come from a time before anything's even written. The players don't know them. They may be unknowable. They may have unknowable objectives. We have ancient families that the city itself is 2,000 years old. So we have ancient families that may be influenced by horrible sorcery, trying to live forever and using the scions of their family to go off and bring them children so that they can eat and continue to live. The city is built on a swamp. So there's swamp things out there, ancient swamp things that are waiting. As you go delve into the caves in the swamp, something might come out of there and eat your face, or it might be intelligent, or it just might be just hanging off of you. We named it, the city's called Eversink because the buildings are forever sinking. Why they are forever sinking, that's an interesting question. But as they sink, we always keep building on top of the buildings as they sink. So you have to ask yourself what's living in those basements. It's 2,000 years of forgotten basement living underneath the city. As you can probably imagine, the city below is much bigger than the city above. So what's in there? We deliberately made sorcery horrible. It was a definite and deliberate design choice to make sorcery not only horrible, but a choice of how to inflict the downside consequences of using sorcery. So the sorcerers and the cults out there are finding victims in which to place all of their corruption. They may be corrupting parts of the city or something outside the city or children. Kevin has intelligent fungoids that live under the city. We also built into the city an ancient races that lived before, of which there is very little information, but much to find. So we can draw on the mythos and stories that were written about the mythos and not deliberately use the actual characters from the mythos, but pull on those themes and bring those themes in to bring a coherent setting so that the characters can both find fun and interest and find things to investigate, plus to give the tools to the GM to unleash just horrible things upon their players.
So Kevin, the subject of investigation brings up the rules for Swords of the Serpentine, which take the Gumshoe engine and adapt them to fantasy. And so what rule structures do you use to emphasize the horrific side of fantasy investigation and mystery?
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting because when I first got the idea for the game, I was actually listening to a Cardas episode when you were interviewing Epediah Ravishal talking about Swords Without Masters. And I thought, you can't really do swords and sorcery and gumshoe. And by the time the interview was over, we figured out how. The way that we do that is take a look at the original sword and sorcery fantasy novels and how they handle investigation. And for instance, Conan stories, full of investigation. Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which turned out to be our primary inspiration, chock full. Whether it's Conan trying to find out how to survive in a crumbling city, or Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser trying to steal back a gem from a bird goddess's temple in the heart of Langmar. I wanted to echo that. We did that with 4 different professions: your thief, your sorcerer, your warrior, and your sentinel, which is more like a inquisitor or a city guard. And each profession has 4 unique investigative abilities that define that profession. And some of those, not all of them, but some of those are fairly Lovecraftian. For instance, Spirit Sight, which is a sentinel ability, lets the character see into the spirit world that overlies the city of Eversink. Not only to talk to ghosts or to interact with ghosts, but possibly to rip a hole between worlds and walk into the city, into the spirit world itself. There's a theory that the spirit world is nothing more than the memories of the goddess, the patron goddess of the city. And so you can walk into that goddess's memories, seeing all the hideous things that were there before humanity, or to watch the ghosts of buildings rise and fall around you. As Emily alluded to, we handle sorcery with an investigative ability called corruption, where you are, to gain power for your really powerful spells, you're ripping a hole between worlds. And the place that power is coming from is never a good thing. So the rules end up defining one type of corruption, if you don't want to hurt your friends, as internalizing it. So every time you cast a particularly powerful spell, something changes on your body. You get an extra nipple, you get a mole, 2 of your toes fused together. If you're lucky, nobody notices. If you fail your health roll, it's going to be a change that that gradually disfigures you and changes you over the years.
Gar, when we go back to the classic form of fantasy role-playing, which is the F20 games, which is a term I use to describe D&D and all of its literal and spiritual progeny, the basic unit of fun in D&D is the fight scene. How do you create a fight scene against Lovecraftian foes so that it feels different, so that it feels like a true fusion of fantasy and Lovecraftian horror?
Well, I mean, Lovecraft really doesn't do action scenes for the most part. Doesn't do fight scenes. So if you're sort of hewing close to Lovecraftian to things, then your fight scene is going to be about escaping the monsters as opposed to killing them. It's going to be like, you know, a chase scene with ghouls chasing you, or deep ones, or Cthulhu cults or something, where the aim isn't to defeat all your foes. It's basically like, you know, get to the far side of the map, or hold the, like, you know, the gangplank of the boat so you can flee, or find your way out of the dungeon before they eat you. That's sort of the extreme Cthulhuid end, or extreme, like, you know, Lovecraftian bleak cosmos end. A more sort of traditional approach would be to run fight scenes where the big bad can't be defeated by, like, sheer force of arms alone. You can't slay the monster, but you can complete to banish him, or kill the high priest before it fully brings the monster into the world. You can, like, you know, throw down the monoliths that are being guarded by all these cultists. If you destroy them in time, then you save the day. And if the monster actually comes through, if, like, Cthulhu manifests or whatever, then it's all over. But you can, at the last moment, complete some ritual action in the game to stop them. And then if you go for, like, sort of full-on D&D, where the player characters are basically nascent demigods themselves and are, like, high-level monsters who are going to kill Cthulhu, then the key there is to make the Cthulhu monster strange and disturbing mechanically. Fantasy gamers tend to feel the mechanics almost viscerally. Like, you know, if I say, like, you know, oh, Cthulhu smashes you across the room, the player goes, yeah, fine. If you say, at 200 points of damage in one hit, then the player goes, I know how that really hits me on multiple levels. So yeah, I mean, it depends on how hopeless and bleak you want your universe to be versus how heroic which fantasy you want, and sort of tailor your fights based on that.
So Sandy, an element of Lovecraft that already has fantasy in it, of course, is the Dreamlands. So how do you handle the Dreamlands in your project?
Oh, you're muted.
Our initial approach is to be producing an entire Dreamlands book and game, which is going to probably come out late this year or late next year. But our shorthand approach for the meantime is to place have the individual scenarios that have Dreamland things. I moderate them. I talk to the authors and make sure that everything, it seems like it's different natural rules. And in general, this is a thing I've done with Lovecraft, fitting them into D&D. The way I do it is I don't place the Lovecraft monsters on one of the 9 planes of existence. They're from outside the whole cosmos that D&D has. The Lovecraft magic is a whole separate branch of magic. Emily and Kevin were able to make a whole magic system from scratch. I had to use what D&D had, so I said, well, Lovecraft's outside this. It's unnatural stuff coming in, causing trouble. So the Lovecraft deities I have, they literally change basic natural laws when they show. They don't have hit points to kill. Like when Cthulhu comes, he changes the geometry so that when you're running away from him, it's further than when you're going towards him. And if he comes more strongly, then you actually start going in a circle, little pocket universe and so forth. So the Dreamlands is simply, for us, it's another aspect of this element of the Lovecraft things, that they're breaking all the rules, they're coming in, they're messing up all this carefully crafted D&D backstory that has been invented over, 50 years, and suddenly these things are a threat to the reality that you're structuring. And Dreamlands isn't a threat necessarily, but it follows the principle of these natural laws aren't the same. You can think up things in the Dreamlands sometimes and have it be real.
So Emily, how would you set about creating a premise for a scenario that will allow the fantasy characters to explore the Lovecraftian side of your setting?
I'd probably lean into Ancient and Forbidden Secrets. Eversink is built on top of a forgotten race and forgotten secrets. And then one of the big themes in the Cthulhu mythos is tripping over a book or a spell or some hidden knowledge found in a library or happenstance or in a painting, and then leaning into that and things just slowly and surely spiraling out of control. If I was going to build that particular scenario, I would actually start from the endpoint of it went out of, somebody already found the book, it went out of control, horrible things already happened, somebody's already unleashed sorcery, and somebody's slammed corruption into an entire block of children, for example. And then start from the investigator from that. So I kind of like to start from the point of in media res of there's this, we know as a GM, right, building the fantasy scenario that there's this book or it's something horrible and it's from an ancient society, and if you go down into the underbasements, you're going to start unearthing all this stuff, and somebody's already done that, and somebody's already gone there, and they've already unleashed it, and it's already happened. And then start with the characters following whatever is the consequence of those actions and following that back to the source. So things start normal from a normal investigative point of view, and then slowly but surely get worse and worse and worse and worse as they uncover that pieces of the mythos that lead them to the underbasement and finally to the horrors of whatever it is that they unleashed. So that's how I would go about building it, Neversink.
So, Ken, in a great historical irony, you, who in any other room that Sandy is not in, is a Lovecraftian without peer, but your own players do not love the Lovecraft. Yet you are working on a fantasy setting. Have you been tempted to add Lovecraftian elements, or are you going to add them to the published version, if not the one you're running for your players?
Robin is alluding to my ongoing 13th Age game, which is a fantasy game designed by Rob Heinsoe and Jonathan Tweet, who designed respectively 4th and 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. It's a terrific game. We're all having a great fun with it. As you pointed out to Gar, it's fun to have a game where the fight scene has to carry the narrative, so that every fight has to be about something in the same way that every song in a musical has to be about something. So that's great fun. And yes, I have a player who is very strongly Lovecraft allergic. Now, fortunately, because of the nature of 13th Age, in which the world is defined by 13 iconic figures, in my case, because it's set in the 3rd century BC, those figures are the Olympian gods, there's lots of other gods that are mad that they're not one of the 13 and they're trying to tear them down. And they began dealing with Moloch over in Carthage, and now they're in India, and the various Hindu gods are not super happy about being, either ignored or called versions of Heracles and Zeus. So there's a lot of old gods, forgotten gods, angry gods storyline of a Lovecraftian nature that's already present. And the designers of 13th Age have presented us lots of horrible monsters. So I can even have primordial things from before the gods, because the Greeks had the Titans. So as long as I just give everything the name of a Titan, I can get as many Lovecraftian yayas out as I want. And then the player characters, including the character who objects to Lovecraft, decided to awaken the unknown mysterious power of a mountain to briefly inconvenience their foes. And that turned out to be Hastur. And when I was called on it, I pointed out, this is the Biersian Hastur that you awakened, not the Lovecraftian Hastur. This is not my fault. You did it. So yes, I've been sliding things in as much as I possibly can. There's Tritons and Telkines. The Telkines are a dog-fish blend that lived under the water that have been pestering them. Are they deep ones? Who can say? Do they live in glory and wonder forever under the ocean? Absolutely. That's all I can tell you. Dagon, real historical god. They've run into him. So yeah, it's easy, and indeed was done repeatedly by fantasy authors to interweave the traditional historical mythos in historical gods and demons in with the Lovecraftian mythos. And in when I do finish Hellenistica, 5e compatible, will it have Lovecraftian allusions? Yes, I think yes is the answer you're looking for, Robin.
So Kevin, you're known for lighthearted designs. Owl Hoot Trail is D&D in the Old West. Time Watch is sort of loose and funny. So how would you go about running a Lovecraftian flavored game for a group of people who want to emphasize the dark humor rather than the cosmic horror?
Oh boy, that's a good question, because I'm not sure that I would. I have a deep allergic to what we call Cthulhu cathomity. It doesn't mesh well.
Cthulhu is in Time Watch, Kevin.
That's true. Robin, I think that you think Time Watch is funnier than it actually is. While there's absolutely a pulp component, a big one, right, with giant radioactive mutant cockroaches and psychic velociraptors, the Cthulhu component of it is deadly serious. But to answer your question, I think that there is a balance between focusing on the innate corruption that the Lovecraftian mythos brings and the horror that it can do, while still making sure that the players and perhaps even the characters are having fun, that perhaps they're not as personally threatened as they were otherwise, that you slip sort of jump scares and even a little bit of outright comedy in place with the people that you meet, so that you have a taste of that horror without necessarily the utter view of the huge meaningless void that a Lovecraftian game would normally focus on.
So Gar, you've got a group of players, let's say hypothetically, that have heard of Cthulhu, they've heard of horror, but they like D&D, they want to stick within the elements of something familiar. So what would you put together as a famed creator of Cthulhu scenarios to demonstrate the Lovecraftian style within the parameters of D&D?
I mean, D&D is already so steeped in Lovecraftian adjacent stuff that, I mean, as long as you sort of steer clear of the, you go mad, everyone dies approach to Cthulhu-wide stuff, everything else works fine in D&D. You could easily do like the Shadow of Innsmouth or the Dome of Horror as a D&D scenario. Like you just have some isolated village and some weird sorcerer. You lack obviously in D&D weird sorcerers are 10 a penny as opposed to having one old Wizard Wakely out in the moors. But you can get a lot of the Lovecraftian flavor in straight D&D. I mean, so many of the monsters are Lovecraftians, and I guess the key is having more investigation element to the game, to give the players that feeling of uncovering secrets and horrors and discovering what's going on, as opposed to just bouncing from fight scene to fight scene.
And what sort of set design would you use? There's sort of classic places that we think of as being Lovecraftian, and a bunch of them could easily be turned into dungeons or dungeon-like environments. At the Mountains of Madness is a dungeon exploration. Are there other sort of classic setting devices that come to mind, Gar?
You could. I mean, obviously, isolated rural town, Innsmouth the Dummage can be done in D&D very easily. It's lower the tech level. I'm suddenly really tempted to do a sort of Lichtenberg University meets Glantry and have this Wizards University with Lovecraftian lurking horrors in the basement, which would be no fun of fun. And adventure parties being sent out across the world in expeditions to investigate lost cities. The other thing to do is you can draw on the Dreamlands and you could run a D&D campaign set in the Lovecraft Dreamlands and run that fairly straight with somewhat odder section of monsters.
So at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. So use the raise hands feature, which is in the participants. Oh, some people already know how to do this. Let me hit the participants button to bring them up. And so at this point, I'm going to try and have just 2 people answer each question so that more people have a chance to ask questions. And our first questioner, let's go to Wayne Rossi.
Hey, so I know Ken talked about using like a couple other writers who are like quote Lovecraft adjacent with Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts on bringing in specifically like Dunsanian influence and leading into that, you know, as well as the material in Lovecraft's dream cycle as far as bringing this into fantasy.
Ken, Dunsany, how do you bring him in?
I mean, Lovecraft has already done such a great job of bringing Dunsany in by basically trying to out-Dunsany in the Dreamlands. If you're trying to aim for the direct Dunsany with the gods of Pagana and the rest of it, I think to connect that up to a regular old D&D game, you either have to change the cosmology of your game such that, oh, nope, our world is just one soap bubble being dreamed up by Mana Sudyushai. I think that's the name of the dreaming god in Dunsany. And you can hop from soap bubble to soap bubble, and that becomes sort of an infra or eka Dunsanian adventure. Or you just simply aim, and this is the harder thing to do, aim at the table for a note of whimsy and mystery. And so rather, if you meet the Gnolls, rather than just saying, oh, they're 4 hit dice and we can kill them and they do this and they are dog-headed dudes, they have a request and they are we need more rope to tie up halflings with. We see you guys, you're always bringing this rope into our dungeon, and you know we kill you and it's great, but if we could just go right to the source, if you could be our factors on the surface and buy rope for us, that would be great. And then, you know, they hook you up with the blood rubies that they've got stored down there. No, don't wait, that blood ruby, that's just a slang term for a ruby made out of blood. And then you can play it in that sort of lighthearted tone that matches Dunsany's tone. But the trouble is that tone is something you have to get every player at a table to buy into, or it falls apart. And horror is that's the secret of horror, is getting everyone to buy into horror. Horror is at least an easy tone that everyone gets and wants to be involved in, especially if, you know, the GM screen says of Cthulhu anywhere on it. But getting people to buy into whimsy, especially if it means that their characters won't be able to just kill all the Gnolls and take the blood rubies for themselves, it creates an expectations game. So if your players are up for it, if they're all Dunsany fans or of a lighthearted spirit, then I think you can do it in tone. Otherwise, you sort of have to go for a Dunsanian cosmology and just hope that the tone carries through, because in one of these soap bubble worlds, all the foes are just sort of feckless and goofy, and maybe cutting your way through them seems tiresome, and you decide to play into the rules of that world socially.
Emily, is there room in Swords of the Serpentine for that sort of kind of Art Nouveau fairy tale style of fantasy that precedes Robert E. Howard and Fritz Leiber and that they drew on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantasy setting. You can run it in whatever tone you'd like. It's still a gumshoe game, so it's still an investigative game. So there still has to be a mystery at the heart of it for the players to unearth. It's not D&D where you go from town to town and kill a boss. It is still fundamentally a gumshoe game. But that said, it can be run in whatever tone you would like. That's how the city is designed. It's still just a city. If you want to be a whole bunch of monks running around in the forest, as long as there's a mystery at the heart of it, you can be a bunch of monks running around the forest. If you're worried about wanting to save a princess from a tower, we have literal towers, which are full of literal princesses. Now, the princesses may be decrepit, old, and covered in God knows what, and practice sorcery and wants to drink your blood, but we definitely have princesses literally at the top of towers. We could put a dragon in the inner basements if you would like. It's just you're probably going to have to make a deal with the dragon. Instead of killing it, he's going to want to have a place in the government, and he's going to want to have a say, and he's probably going to want to bring in democracy, and that's just not going to fly. So it's So you can definitely bring in that sort of lighthearted tone into Eversink.
So we had a new person that we haven't seen before with their hand up, and now they've been swallowed by the Shoggoth of Bandwidth, I assume. So Eric Paquette, can you jump in with your question, please?
Thank you. My question is, how does one integrate Lovecraftian horror into Arthurian fantasy for like maybe a game of Pendragon or in any other game where you're playing King Arthur's court?
Well, that depends on what Arthurian mythos that you enjoy reading. There's a huge difference between some of the stories that can't come out of like Anglo-Saxon time and Middle English times, and Sir Thomas Malory.
I'd say there's two different tools you can use to shoehorn in the Lovecraftian element. One is the continued belief in some Arthurian things about the old ones, or the people that lived a long time ago, or the things that were there in the bad old pagan days, and those leftovers or holdovers can be something bad. And the other is in Fairyland, which there's the Red Knights, the Fairy Knights that show up all the time, and they're almost always bad, but Fairy Knights are really just another way of having another universe impinge upon you. So I'd say those are the two shoehorns to bring in Lovecraft, if you want. Two tools that are already waiting there in Lovecraft to pull that lever.
One thing about Arthurian mythos that you could lean in pretty deeply is that ultimately Arthurian mythos is about change. It's about the old times and then the new times coming in and just making the old ways disappear and just paving over them, right? So Arthur and his court's like the last stand against the new and the banal. So you can definitely use Arthurian to dig into the old ways. Take a look at some Welsh myth. There's a lot of stuff there that you can use and grab onto that can merge into Cthulhuian mythos.
James Holloway, you have a question.
Thank you. So one thing that is a common feature of fantasy games, of course, is playing protagonists who are themselves not human, who are themselves, intrinsically magical in some way. What are some, fun and interesting ways to incorporate Lovecraft elements into the player characters, rather than having the player characters just be like ordinary people who venture into a Lovecraftian world? How do you, balance the keeping player characters relatable and playable while adding some element of Lovecraftian horror to them?
So Gar, your exciting fantasy novel has a ghoul protagonist. So I think we need you to tell us how to play ghouls and deep ones as player characters in a fantasy game.
Yeah, I mean, on some levels, there isn't much more disturbing about a ghoul or a deep one than there is about an elf or dwarf. You can play elves as being deeply scary, eldritch creatures, these like deep forces of nature. And lots of player characters have disturbing stuff in their backgrounds. And the key is basically working the setting so that the character can be playable, that its Lovecraftian weirdness doesn't dominate the game completely, and that every session isn't about hiding the character's ghoulness or whatever. And after that, it's just about giving that character a chance to show off their disturbing weirdness in a way that's memorable and fun for the players. But I mean, in a gaming universe where Vampire exists as or any of the White Wolf games, I don't think ghouls are a step too far. And also, for the deep ones, you've got a whole campaign arc there where basically you're fighting against your eventual destiny to turn to a fish and go off to get half-life.
So Ken, if I'm playing in your 13th Age game, and my one unique thing is that I have a strange pull toward the sea, and my ancestors all live in a weird fishing town, what do you do with that?
The trouble with the one unique thing in a game, I mean, in general, is that you, in a group where you've got 6 players, you've got 6 unique things. So if your player is like, my one unique thing is I feel a pull towards the sea, and my ancestors interbred with the Telkins in a fishing town, and then the players immediately head for the mountains of Afghanistan, there's not a lot you can do about it, except maybe, if they run into a priest of Poseidon, he is nervous and panicked around him, or something like that. With a player character who wants to be drawn into the story that's happening, that's a gift. So if your player has got that one unique thing, and instead of running off to Afghanistan, they've decided to be pirates on the island of Crete, then you're spoiled for choice about what to do with it. They run into Telkins and Tritons all the time, and some of them, when they massacre the rest of the party, they don't massacre him, or they stop before massacring anyone and say, "Wait, there is a scion among you. Give him to us so that we can raise him properly," and then that becomes a drama, a dramatic icon. Or on the very base level, it's weird. You've been held underwater all this time by that giant octopus, but you're not drowning. Everyone else is drowning. That's strange. I would, assuming that they're trying to play it for weirdness, uncanniness, horror, then that's what you do with it, is invoke appropriate, weird, uncanny, horrific responses from the world by their heritage or their one unique thing. In the same way that if your one unique thing is, I'm the only person who can ride griffins, then, well, you try and toss a griffin into their path so that they can ride it. That's what they are asking for.
Brian Gustafson. Brian, are you with us?
Well, while we're waiting for Brian, I'd like to mention that in my Cthulhu Mythos supplement for D&D and Pathfinder, there is 8 to 10 densely written pages of how to play a ghoul, and also another 8 to 10 how to play a zoo, how to play a Dreamlands cat, and so forth. So I've gone into that in some belabored it to some extent.
Okay, so the question I had is children's fantasies like Coraline or Over the Garden. Well, how might a GM go about introducing something like that into a Lovecraftian fantasy setting? Like darker children's fantasy, where you're sort of following the protagonist through it.
Gar, you have some experience with kids in fantasy. How would you go about doing that?
I mean, like dark kids fantasy is already sort of steeped in Lovecraft adjacent stuff again, like tentacles and wormy things and so forth. So my instinct, as again possibly based on my kids, would be to really go for the sort of spookiness and gory stuff as we're delighting, worms and tentacles and eyeballs and tentacles and things sprouting, and just not quite go for gross out, but go for sort of ickiness. Because I think the Lovecraftian trope of tentacles is a lot more accessible to kids than stuff about cosmic nihilism.
So, Kevin, if you were to do a kid-focused adventure in Eversink for Swords of the Serpentine, how would you go about that?
In fact, we actually did one where all the players are playing orphans, trying to recover something that was stolen from them. And the way that we did that was to start off with what seemed like a very normal thing, where somebody has a bunch of bullies have broken into their home and stolen a bunch of their things, including a particular lantern. And it turns out the lantern was asked for by some really sort of horrible half-human, half-rats masquerading as fully human. and the adventurer takes the small children into confronting them, finding out the hard way exactly what they are, and then possibly chasing them or being dragged down into the warrens beneath the city. So I think the best way that I would do it is to start with a veneer of normality and then put in small little clues that everything is not what it seems to be. And like Gar suggested, pick a particular theme, in this case rats. In the case of Coraline, it was buttons for eyes. And expound on that with the themes as things gets worse and worse.
Lons Frago, you have a question.
Hello? Hello?
Hi.
Hi. All right. So I guess my question was how to put more investigative games into the D&D system, because D&D has a lot of spells that allow you to get a lot of information as soon as possible. So how do you keep things from your players to make it more investigative?
Gar has written a whole book about this called Lore Finder. Tell us about it, Gar.
Well, Lore Finder was for 3rd edition, so some of the mechanical stuff in there is a bit out of date. But I mean, that's basically the same question as in a modern day game. How do you deal with forensics and fingerprinting and DNA analysis? Yeah. The players have these tools. It's up to the GM to know what's available to them. Like, so basically, you need to know what spells the characters have, and then you need to basically construct to put yourself in the shoes of the criminal or cultist whoever the opposition is, and work out how they would counter these things. So, for example, if the players have a telepathy spell that lets them read minds, then the bad guys will either have to have some way of blocking it, or then to think, okay, we know that the investigators are going to try and use telepathy, so we have to do some sort of elaborate thing where we trick our minions into not knowing what our real plan is. And then you basically do the standard mystery thing of building a chain of clues for the characters to discover with like regular investigation and whatever magic they have, and they can follow it along to solve the mystery. But I mean, the presence of divinatory magic and so forth is like doesn't sort of short circuit investigation, or you should avoid just short circuit investigation. And it's just another set of tools the players can use to uncover clues.
And of course, in a Lovecraftian setting where magic is inevitably evil and knowing things is bad, that can really be a double-edged sword. Ken, do you want to talk about the motif of knowing too much is a bad thing and its relationship to fantasy?
It's a hard blend, like Lance was alluding to do in standard Dungeons and Dragons fantasy, where knowing things is just about expanding your options or your power. And in obviously in a pure Lovecraftian sense, which goes back to Faust in a way, knowing things is the opposite of expanding your options and your power. Once you know that the world is a sham, you have no option. And once you have learned something that cores away your mind like an apple, then you have no power. So the two are basically sort of opposites. So you either wind up in a universe in which Dungeons and Dragons magic, like Sandy has, happens in its own little sphere, but there is this outer sphere where these entities exist, and tapping into them can give you the kind of raw power of randomly setting off an atomic bomb, but it's also almost certainly a terrible idea that will poison you to do it. And so if you're presenting magic itself as unholy in that way, or as somehow corruptive, then you've changed Dungeons and Dragons. So I would say that a lot of the fun then of an ongoing story is magic used to work just great, but as this dark universe, this mythos universe grows tangent to it, when you cast divinatory spells, or you cast Shadow Walk, or Invisibility, or Planar Travel, or any of those other sorts of spells, bad things happen. At first, it's just, make a wisdom check, and if you fail it, then you're like, I'm stunned, and then it gets worse because as you do things, ghosts or Cthulhuoid monsters start to be attracted to you. Those ultraviolet devourers start clawing at you. And yeah, you can do the divination, but as you're doing it, these monsters are trying to claw at the edges of your magical sphere and get into our world. Maybe they're just not even really trying to attack you. They're just trying to get out and attack the little village that you're in. And that should be bad enough for any self-respecting bunch of players to worry about. But you present that not as this is how magic has always been, but as if we don't do something to close off this gate, we're not going to be able to do magic and get power and knowledge and options. That's a clear and present threat to us, regardless of the rest of the world. And that maybe is how you combine those two things tonally in a D&D campaign, is make it a big bad, a story arc to be defeated, as opposed to a single one-off. Oh, in this one desert, my divination spells are wonky and I don't like it. I guess that's another way, though. You have the plateau of Lang in your fantasy world where, if you accidentally stumble onto it, yep, that's where your magic goes horrible. But I think it's more fun to make it a challenge as opposed to a place you can put up a do not enter tape and then just don't go there.
So Emily, you've been making some great points in the chat that I'd like you to share with our video audience.
All right, I was just making a joke.
Well, before there were great points.
We're just talking about high-level divination spells, right? And that there's absolutely nothing wrong with high-level divination spells or letting your players acquire knowledge, because at the end of the day, knowledge is just a tool. They can know the entire bad guy's entire plan, but it doesn't mean that the bad guy is static. It doesn't mean that they're going to act appropriately on that information. So for me, I'm just let the players learn and let them figure out what they're going to do from there. Don't try to control them, just let them go. But I also that was just playing off of Gar's comment about how high-level wizards can redirect your divination. I had figured that you cast a high-level divination and you would just end up tuning into old reruns of Green Acres.
So a hideous universe outside our own, like I suggested.
That's right. A truly hideous universe.
We have a new questioner, Dave Aquino.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, so I'm fairly new to the whole horror aspect of tabletop RPG, and well, it might be a stupid question, but I'm only asking that for arcane characters like wizards or sorcerers who are attuned with their magic, who are let's say they're too curious for their own good, does it make it that the eldritch magic they learn will be accessible to them later on, or will they just nope out of that whole thing?
So Sandy, I think this is a good one for you about the eldritch or Lovecraftian magic that fantasy sorcerers wield. Can you expand on that?
Of course, in Call of Cthulhu, in the role-playing games I've done for Call of Cthulhu, obviously magic is completely outside the pale, and you pretty much, although player characters can learn it in Call of Cthulhu, it makes them get more decrepit faster, right? Lose insanity. We have a separate array of Lovecraftian spells in the game I'm doing now, and I think that's a way to do it. If you have Lovecrafty stuff that's outside the universe, alien to everything you have here, different natural rules apply, then that magic, when people use it, they end up like Old Man Whately or the other people in his stories, and so it's primarily a tool for the bad guys. The good guys can use it, as they do, in fact, in the Dunwich Horror, but presumably they don't suffer terribly forever for the Dunwich Horror. But I would always have it be that this is something that's creepy and arcane, and when they find out someone's doing it, they're scared, rather than, oh, cool, a new spell that will blast the enemies from a distance. At least that's my approach.
In the Yellow King role-playing game, which is not explicitly Lovecraftian, but is Lovecraft adjacent, you will, when you buy the next supplement, be able to use
Lovecraft friendly.
Yes, but each of those magic spells comes on a shock card. And when you accumulate either 3 or 4 shock cards, you're too mentally shattered to continue on with your character. So it's the equivalent of insanity in Call of Cthulhu. And so I think that's a fun way to model that idea of magic being very tempting, but also do you want to remember it? And in the case of that system, you can do things to discard the card, maybe before you're going to use it. So it's like, well, I'm starting to get a little weird, and I'm starting to see a fourth dimension, and it's not great, and we have to go down into the basement now, and, well, do I really want to hold on to this magic spell that I have in my head that is causing my these bugs to appear in my peripheral vision? Maybe I'll do this thing to get rid of it. And so that, I think, is a fun way of introducing the idea of giving to the players the choice of, do I want to hold on to this terrible knowledge, or do I want to get rid of it? And that's something that you could then adapt to something, whether it's a more direct adaptation to another Gumshoe game like Swords of the Serpentine, or possibly to a more traditional fantasy game if you want to add that sort of sanity penalty to knowing certain particular abilities. So at this point, we're nearing the end of our hour, and I think everybody with a hand up has had a chance to pose a question. So I guess at this point I would like to ask each of our panelists to describe something that they want to drop into their next fantasy game that has a Cthulhu element to it. So let's go backwards from my initial questioning order and start with Gar. What's the next Lovecraftian thing you're going to drop into a real or hypothetical fantasy game the next time you're going to play it?
Well, I was just thinking there about like blasphemous knowledge and so forth. And the next time I play something with a sort of fancy and spell slot system, I'm going to play with the idea of some sort of, eldritch spell that once it gets into your head, you can't get rid of it quite so easily. It sort of takes up one of your spell slots. You can draw on its magic, but you can't just like cast it and forget it. It's like
Pontypool magic.
You can't unlearn. What was that, Ken?
Pontypool magic.
Indeed.
Kevin, what's the next Lovecraftian element you're going to drop into a fantasy game?
The villain in my next Swords of the Serpentine adventure is a woman who is an artist and a sorceress, and she takes street children and she traps them inside of her paintings. And in order for the heroes to actually free them, they're going to have to find a way to chase her into her paintings themselves and fight in that painted world.
Emily, the next Lovecraftian thing you're going to drop into a fantasy game?
I'm a big fan of old gods and forbidden knowledge. That's, for me, I like players that are curious and then want to start learning things that they really, really shouldn't. And for me, it would be digging deeper and deeper secrets that are under the city until it starts to burst through the filmy bubble of reality to some twisted plane for which everything came from and where all the old gods actually exist. Not as cool as Kevin's.
Ken, what are you going to drop in?
The players right now are working very, very hard to get to the crocodile lich that lives underneath the city of Takshila, and there will be plenty of deniable hints in his lair of the kind of elder knowledge that he's been digging up from under the oldest university in the world. But the one that I'll probably own is there's a monster described in the in Hellenistic writing. It's a sea monster. It's called the Skull of Pendra, and it's straight up in a chronicle. They say someone caught one, and it was 100 feet long and had claws. And I think that the Skull of Pendra would be a lovely thing to put into the Hellenistic Monster Manual, or the Hellenistic Monster section, with all the horror at Martin's Beach on down Lovecraftian possibilities that implies.
And finally, Sandy, our special guest, what Lovecraftian element are you going to drop into the next fantasy game you play?
You guys have these. You guys are all doing these awesome existential things. I've taken on something that perhaps more pedestrian, but also kind of difficult, which is my goal that I have coming up for my next thing. Is I'm trying to write a campaign in which the Sand Dwellers are cool. So that's the bar I've set myself for this. Trying to figure out a way that sand dwellers are a neat and interesting enemy.
For people watching the video later who don't know who the sand dwellers are and why they need that treatment, could you describe them?
The littlest Cthulhu monster, right? The lowest level. Go ahead, tell them.
Ken, can you tell people who sand dwellers are?
Sand dwellers are a thing that was tossed off by August Derleth. Basically, it was something that he mentions, and then admittedly, good for him, Underlethian fashion never comes back to. So they're sort of just guys who live in the desert and are Lovecraftian sad, I guess. There's a novel about them by I think it's Adam Niswander.
Yeah, and it's not terrible.
Yeah, if you're gonna try and make the sand dwellers a thing, Adam Niswander is as close as anyone has gotten. But I'm sure if Sandy just turns the might of his powers to it, he can come up with all manner of neat stuff. But yeah, they're literally a Derleth concept so boring even Derleth didn't go after them is their problem.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my plan to make sand dwellers cool. So I'm working on it.
Well, at this point, if this was an actual panel at a real physical convention, and we all are anxiously waiting the day when that can happen again, this would be the point when the anime kids in the costumes that none of us gray-haired people recognize or know what they are, they'd be looking through the window, waiting for their shot at the room. So it's time for us to clear out the room. So I'd like to thank, first of all of our live attendees for coming, and especially the ones who had great questions for us. And I'd like to especially thank our panelists. It's Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan, Kevin Kulp, Emily Dresner, Kenneth Hite, and of course, Sandy Peterson. So thank you very much, everybody. Our next virtual panels will be part of the Origins virtual go-round, so please join us for some of those. Thanks a lot, everybody.